Alrighty, folks. Well, thank you very much for joining us. I'm Bryan, a principal here at Index Ventures, and I'm very excited to be joined by two of our partners, Mike Volpe and Sarah Cannon. Mike has been with the firm for about a decade, investing in all sorts of companies across many different sectors, with a particular focus in artificial intelligence, open source infrastructure, and all things technical. And then we also have Sarah Cannon on our team, who has been at Index for about 3 years and focuses on investments in productivity, and more recently in artificial intelligence, where I've had the delight of working with her. And we're here to talk about our predictions for 2021. You know, a lot of things have been really difficult for this year for a variety of different people in a variety of different ways, both on the individual level and on the societal level. My question for you guys to start off is, you know, what do you think the silver lining of 2020 has been to try to take a positive spin on it? One, and two, how do you think that on an individual level will feed into 2021 and what the future looks like, given we may have some hope on the horizon with the vaccine news that has been announced recently. And so Sarah, just to keep things coordinated, I'll have you kick us off.
Yeah, I'm happy to. So there's a great quote about necessity is the mother of invention. And, you know, and also a crisis is a terrible opportunity to waste. So I would say out of the shock of the pandemic, I mean, one of the things that has happened is we've realized how much work we can do remotely from all over the world. And, you know, everybody knows remote work has happened this year. But I think what that means from a societal implication perspective is far more people can enter the labor force. So it used to be that if you lived in a certain part of a country or even in a certain part of the world or even rural area rather than in a city, work wasn't accessible to you. And so I think that there is far more people who will be able to participate in the labor force than who weren't before. And even if that's in modularized work, like if you could do a part-time job and you can join a team from remote location for a limited amount of time, or even people who are disabled who couldn't make it to an office, I think the idea is we had all these stereotypes about what work looked like and what an office was and a job. And I think this is kind of blown all of that up at once, which will create kind of more opportunities for a broader set of people.
It's interesting. I think probably my biggest takeaway from this whole thing is that there were a lot of things, whether it's in my work or in my professional life, that I took for granted, that they were in fact incredibly enjoyable things, that they gave me great pleasure, sometimes intellectually, sometimes emotionally, whatever the case may be, but they were totally taken for granted. You know, for example, going into the office and seeing Sarah and Bryan was something that I took totally for granted. It just sort of happened every day and it was no big deal. And being removed from that definitely has taught me, and I think it probably has taught a lot of the people, that some of the things that we consider to be mundane or obvious pre-COVID and pre-pandemic, we will cherish a lot more. We will appreciate a lot more the value of spending a little time with Sarah and Bryan. We will value the opportunity to go to Ghana for 2 weeks and experience what that's like. Those are things that now we sort of recognize more of the privilege of that and the honor of that activity. And as a venture capitalist, I will say that one of the funnest things we do is we get to meet with founders and entrepreneurs. And, you know, somehow for me, I will forever more respect the opportunity to actually physically meet with entrepreneurs and founders rather than have them be a box on my wonderful Dell monitor that I'm staring at right now. So I think one of the great things that come out of this is a reminder of some of the special things that we enjoy in our daily life and how much we need to. I often like to joke about how we're going to do it with revenge, with a strong desire to do it again. But I think it'll stem from the fact that we've been reminded of some of the most amazing things that we get to enjoy about our daily lives.
Mike mentioned Ghana, where I had the great fortune to live for a year of my life. But it reminded me of something, which is when I lived there, I took cold showers, which, you know, I was not my experience growing up. And I had cold showers for a year, and every day, and that was, 14 years ago. And every day still, when I have hot water, I'm grateful for it. And I think one of the interesting questions will be, how long do these impacts stick with us? How long does this, I really hope Mike, I'm going to remind him if he's annoyed with me next year that he didn't get to see me and how much he missed Bryan and I. But I think it's a very interesting question. Also, as an investor, we've seen a lot of behaviors change. things shift to online, payments, groceries, education, how much of that is going to persist? People are traveling less. When you're looking to invest in new companies, and I've seen Mike do this many times, it's like, well, how much of this is just COVID? Well, that's caused shifts. How much of those are going to stick is a really interesting question that I look forward to seeing when we revert to normal. But I think people have stopped saying that because normal has fundamentally changed, but just how much will be interesting to see.
Yeah, I don't think we'll know, right, until we go back to whatever normal is. And I don't know that we'll fully appreciate how strange this has all been because we're still living it, right? I think there's going to be a period of time, a year down the road after we're kind of back to whatever normal looks like, where we look back on this, we're like, oh, that was kind of wild. And so I think this mixture of appreciation for the mundane, but excitement for the future in a way that I don't think has been true for quite some time because we have so much pent up energy makes for a pretty interesting combination heading into 2021. Particularly given one of the things I mentioned at the very beginning is some of the news around the vaccine, right? I'm kind of curious, have either of you seen that news impacting the startup market, or if things more or less been kind of quote unquote business as usual?
It turns out that in many categories, and especially in digital categories where we VCs take part in, they haven't been nearly as bad as we thought they would be. And if they weren't that bad through this pandemic, imagine if now life would go back to normal, things will look fantastic. So I think that we are going to experience a continued somewhat of a euphoria in everything that has to do with new company formation, new company funding, rapid deployment of these technologies and use of them, and so on and so forth. Obviously we have a government that's, especially the US government, that's taking very aggressive policies to stimulate the economy, and that will probably continue given what the unemployment rate is. And as long as that's true, I think we're going to experience a very bullish market. And it's hard to crystal ball it because we're going to get a new administration and we're going to get a new leader of the Treasury and the Fed and so on and so forth. But, I would certainly expect a very optimistic first half of 2021. And then we'll see what the second half holds, depending on how, our government chooses to enact its policies.
Yeah, I'd say it's too soon to tell on the impact of the vaccine on our market. There's also step zero is having the vaccine. Well, I shouldn't say zero. There's a tremendous amount of work that I respect deeply, life-changing, world-changing work to get into it. But then there's distribution of the vaccine, then people have to take it. So I would say I think there's a lot of optimism, which, as Mike says, has been priced in to the markets today, but there's a lot of implementation that has to happen for it to impact people's behaviors, right? There's also a lag. So there's distribution, people have to take it, and then people need to actually trust that it's safe. And so I think all of that process is going to take a lot longer than people are pricing in today. And so but the good news is, as Mike said, we're in a long-term business. Like, we're investing in companies in venture that we, hope to exist for a very, very long time. And we're partnering with them for, 7 to 10 years. And so I don't think actually we've seen a slowdown even throughout the pandemic. I mean, that's been the shocking thing. Like, we as a firm sat down and thought, okay, well, it's going to be harder for people. We're going to likely see fewer companies being started, fewer investment opportunities. And that has not been our experience. And I don't think that's been the experience of other firms, because people take a long-term view, and there was going to be a vaccine that was going to be developed at some point, and people were going to go back to consuming things. So, it's changed maybe what companies people are starting, which we can talk about. But I'd say the entrepreneurial activity impressively all over the world, especially in the US and Europe, where we spend most of our time, has really been quite robust throughout this. I guess when people are home, they think more about starting companies, but it's been persistent.
Yeah, I think that's true, right? Whether it's starting a company or deciding you want to be a photographer full time or whatever it might be, I think, one of our colleagues, Mark Fiorentino, at the very beginning of the shutdown said, this is a really interesting exercise in intrinsic motivation. People that were excited about what they were doing continued to be excited, and people who weren't excited about what they were doing came to kind of realize that. And people that had that thing that they'd been putting off for a long time and been like, oh, one day I'll get to it, I think now they've had a lot of time to, one, think about that thing, because there isn't, for a lot of folks, terribly too much else to do when they're not working from home. And two, to Mike's point on appreciating things, I think you're like, I've been sitting here waiting to take this shot, and I've had a large chunk of time where I haven't been able to go about doing it. I got to do it now. Right. I've learned my lesson that, life doesn't last for forever and things can change very quickly, which I think is kind of embedded in all of our psyche in some form or fashion. Sarah, you mentioned that you think there's a particular set of companies that are going to come out of this. I'd imagine partially as a result of the immediate change in the work environment, the world environment, as well as a function of people just having a lot of time to sit around and think about it often. I'd love to hear about what some of those categories are and what some of the exciting opportunities you think will arise from there.
I think the set of new companies that we've seen created, a lot of them are video native. So, we were seeing video was not embedded in a lot of the kind of software products that we use. So a lot of products that leverage video have seen, I think, quite an acceleration, or we've seen more of these companies started. So that can range from telemedicine companies getting greater adoption, education companies, getting more traction, or virtual conferences, things that used to happen, offline that are now coming online. So that's kind of an obvious near term. The second I would say is transactions. So you've seen a lot of kind of contactless payments, or even the experience of going to a restaurant or into a local store. There's been a lot of kind of financial technology innovations, a lot more payments kind of happening digitally than did before. I expect that to stay. So I'd say those are two. And then lastly, in delivery. So around food delivery. I mean, that was something that, a smaller subsegment of people in cities used to have kind of groceries delivered or get takeout. And now you've seen kind of a far broader set of products being delivered, and a lot of companies, and the economics for those businesses traditionally had been a lot harder. And I think now that there's a scale of people using them, it makes the economics of those businesses a lot more attractive. So I would say those are three categories where we've certainly seen an acceleration in technology development and product innovation during this time.
The thing that I find interesting, almost all the things that Sarah just talked about are actually substitutions of what used to be human to human analog interactions to an interaction that occurs between a digital system of some variety and a person, or two persons being intermediated by a digital system, right? So if you think about it, like when I went to the grocery store, there was very little digital going on other than when the checkout happened. The rest was a very human process. But now, if I use Instacart, there's an enormous amount of digital engagement that's happening before even the checkout, right? So essentially what all these things that Sarah's talking about, which are essentially introducing digital into an environment that used to be fundamentally analog, they produce an enormous amount of downstream data, like tons and tons more data than we ever used to experience. When two people walked into a room and had a conversation, there was zero digital data that was being produced. This recording thing that we're doing right now has an enormous amount of digital data associated with it. And so every business that can actually harness that amount of data exhaust from the transformation of an analog world to a digital world will do really, really well. And that's why I think that we're going to see an enormous amount of interesting companies that are coming out that are organizing, making sense out of moving, storing, computing, querying data, are going to be massive beneficiaries of the shift. Just so much more of what we do is going to be digital, therefore producing data, therefore having embedded meaning inside of all that data that's being produced, which is going to improve the products more quickly, which is going to facilitate the invention of new products that we haven't seen before. So I'm actually super excited about the downstream data implications of all the stuff that Sarah was talking about.
Yeah, I think when you pair that giant growth in data with some of the advances that are going on in the natural language process space, one of the things that I get excited about for the future is I'm a very nostalgic person, right? I actually quite like analog things, which is a bit ironic given what we all do for a living. But if you think about ways of engaging with the past, 2 generations ago, it was largely photographs, and then it became video. But now with all the data that we're collecting through text messages, talking with another video, you can imagine a new form of engaging with people from the past that is, based on a machine learning model that is a recreation of a conversation with that person. So perhaps the wax museums of today will later on be us having a conversation with insert famous person here. Of course, with all technology, that's a positive, long-term potential outcome of some of this technology. But, no technology exists without a darker side to it, right? I think that's the reality of human progress in general. That has been very center stage, I think, over the past year. I think along with COVID and the election, the third big issue that's probably been all over the news more than anything else is regulation and technology, particularly around the collection of data, as you discussed, Mike. So I'm curious, what are your guys' thoughts on the direction that's going to go, both kind of in the short term and the medium term, and how does that impact or not impact some of the things that we might be able to build with that data, given it might be a little bit more locked down? And how do you think about those trade-offs?
I'm happy to start. I think, it's exposed massive gaps in our regulatory infrastructure. You guys know this, but I was fortunate to work for President Obama during the last financial crisis. And frankly, there weren't regulations that existed to think about, the digital exhaust that Mike talked about and what the implications of that might be. Or, let's take social networks, because that's a kind of a clear example. But you have people uploading content at a rate at which humans certainly can't regulate all the content. One. Two, algorithms can't even do a good enough job of keeping, content that you may not want on the internet off. And third, we don't have rules around what that should look like. So I'd say, I think that is one of the many, gaps that has been revealed from an economic infrastructure perspective. I mean, Keynes, my favorite economist, reading one of his books now, but says you need rules of the road for an economy to function. And we don't have rules of the digital world, or rules, the rules of the world impacted by, artificial intelligence. So, whether that's bias or, regulation of content, or monopoly is another one, which I think is quite interesting to talk about. I mean, the nature of AI is kind of more data makes it more predictive. So it's going to increase the winner take most dynamics in markets. The advantage to having data is ever greater in a world where AI is determining that leadership. So I think, that's going to have massive implications for concentrations of markets, and how do we as a country or as a world, do we want to regulate that, or how do we define it? Actually, my first day at Index, I remember Mike and I went on a walk and got into a discussion about monopoly. It was like, well, Sarah, it's defined by, being able to influence pricing. And I was like, well, maybe that's going to have to be redefined. Maybe it's the amount of your attention. And anyway, so those are some of the policy topics that I think are around the corner.
Yeah, and I think, Sarah, one of the difficult things, being Index and, inherently for ourselves being somewhat globally minded, one of the complexities that layers on top of what you said is that there are cultural differences, enormous differences in terms of what is in fact acceptable. Because let's take the antitrust conversation that you were just raising. The standards for antitrust in the U.S. and those in Europe are very different. The standards for privacy are quite different in Europe versus what they are in the United States. And even within the United States, if you look at CCPA, which is the California legislation, some states will follow and other states may not. And so the complexity in navigating through all this stuff is that when it comes to issues of privacy in particular, there are extremely different notions of what is acceptable depending on which country or geography in the world that you're thinking about. And the part that's difficult about privacy is that we use one word to encapsulate it, but in fact it's a very complicated thing. And the answer can't be like, okay, I'm going to let the consumer choose, because it's too complicated oftentimes for the consumer to actually choose it. I think it's one of those things that we somewhat have to choose for or on behalf of consumers as to what is the default acceptable and the default open and the open and the close and what's in the in-between state that's okay. So it's going to pose very, very complicated questions. It'll be very tough to harmonize it on a global basis because of our cultural differences that exist. And I think it's one of those problems that unfortunately we're going to be struggling with for quite some number of years. I don't think we're going to get out of this pickle anytime soon.
Mike, I have to ask you, do you think there's going to be a new international regulatory body? Because if we have the WHO, I mean, whenever you have this disharmony, there have been World Trade Organization, the UN for foreign policy issues. Like, is there going to be, we have the IMF for economic ones. Is there going to be a technology data regulatory institution, you think?
I don't know. I think the complexity will be how the US behaves, right? Because the biggest beneficiaries of this data exhaust expansion that there's been are US companies. They're Google, Facebook, Amazon, Apple, people like that. Europe doesn't have companies like that, at least for the time being. And so Europe's kind of natural inclination, if implied through a regulatory consortia of some variety, will be to more regulate it, to bound the control that these American giants, tech giants, have on their world. Whereas in the US, it's not as black and white as to whether it's good or bad that those companies have that data, because they employ a lot of people, because they increase the strength of the United States from a global perspective, et cetera, et cetera. So leave China aside, which we will never join this type of an organization because their ideas around privacy are completely different. There'll be an interesting question whether the US would want to participate in those. And my gut feeling is it'll be a little bit difficult.
Yeah, I think the challenge too is there, Sarah, you mentioned kind of an international governing body. Mike, you mentioned kind of the differences between individual countries. I think you see the same thing with company to company within the US, right? If you look at some of the election stuff, Twitter and Facebook in particular took very, very different approaches to how to go after solving that problem. Because it's such a complex, nuanced issue. And so I think even getting to a place where there's agreement within a single country is difficult enough, much less kind of internationally. And so I do think it'll be interesting to see how we go about resolving this, because it is very much an international issue. But to what extent do you think, we talked about kind of regulation from a government perspective. I think another big issue that's come up as a result of all of this is kind of social responsibility in the context of private institutions, right? And what that line looks like. I'm curious what your thoughts are on, how that has changed over the past year, if at all. Do you think that we're moving into a world where the expectation of the consumer and certainly the employee is that private institutions take a more active role in social issues, whether that's privacy or diversity? There's many things. But I'm curious if you think the temperature there has changed and what that means for the next 3 to 5 years of technology companies.
Absolutely. This has been one of the most dramatic things. I think the combination of some of the protests around Black Lives Matter and the pandemic, I would say a lot of people have, and this has been happening actually for a longer period of time than just this year, but I think a lot of people's trust in government is very low, and this is substantiated by a lot of data, and that's deteriorated even more in recent years. And given that's true, and there are a lot of things happening in the world, the pandemic, for example, people actually, I think, are starting to expect more from the companies that they work for. And I've seen this, and I'm curious if Mike has seen the same, but across the founders that I am fortunate to work with, their employees are asking for a lot more from CEOs than I think people traditionally asked from CEOs. So they expect the leaders of their companies to have a view on climate change, to have response to the protests, to lead on diversity. They're not looking for the government to deal with these kind of macro societal challenges. They're expecting, because they've lost faith in that, but I think another generation might have had that expectation. But it's much more, I am an employee of Slack, and therefore I expect Stuart Butterfield, the founder, to do something about diversity, about climate, in a way that, is a different expectation. And I think some of that is lack of faith in government. I think some of that is a generational, change, that a lot of millennials have different views of the roles of companies in society. But I have been, at least the companies I work with, which are largely Silicon Valley based, definitely there's been a change in demands on behalf of employees. And I think that's frankly a challenge for founders who are trying to be thoughtful and want to be responsive, but it's a whole new set of how much of this do I want to take on trying to build my business? Can that be an accelerant? And how do I respond?
Yeah, well, Sarah, I think that's true. The thing that I find that I expect to happen is that different companies will take a very different stance on their involvement around these societal issues. We've already seen the folks at Coinbase basically saying, look, this is a place where you go to work, leave, check your political and social belief systems at the door, or you've seen people take much more lean in kinds of positions. And I actually think it's okay to have that range. And what ultimately individuals will do, because especially in tech, individuals have a lot of choice as to where they end up going to work. They will go to work in a place that aligns most with their own belief system of what a company's responsibilities are and how they're dealing with it. And I actually don't think that it should be legislated. I think we should allow companies a fair degree of latitude in terms of how they deal, either intensely or not intensely at all, with this problem. And we're going to have a spectrum of companies, and people will sort. And because the beautiful system of America is capitalism, the ones that actually end up having the correct position will become a center of gravity for more people, will draw more talent, and that will cause other companies that slowly but surely emulate that perspective. So I would say allow companies to be different in this view. Do not regulate too much. Some companies will be very lean in. Some companies will be very lean out and leave that stuff at the door. I suspect that particularly with millennials, companies that actually have a position and a psychology and a point of view will be preferred. They will get better employees and they will succeed. I could be wrong, but I think we should just let this sorting happen in a very natural and capitalistic way. And we'll see how it kind of plays out.
It's a very interesting market forward. Sorry, Bryan, just one thought on this, and I'm curious your thoughts. But I agree that there should be latitude for companies to decide, and employees have choice. But there's one thing that is a fear of mine, which is I don't want it to become, I think it's good companies come up with their stance, but not to become political. And I do think you've seen a polarization in the United States, again, referencing the country where I live, but I don't want that to come to companies either. So if it's a stance on how involved I'm going to be in political life, that's okay. But I would hate for it to become partisan and people not feeling like I want, regardless of your political views, I want you to, be able to work at Index, be able to work at the companies that I work with. And I think that's, it's a delicate balance between those things. And I don't want it to be that people feel like if they're of different views, they can't work at some companies. And in Silicon Valley, I feel like I've seen that for the first time a little bit over the past months.
Yeah, I would take an approach that I kind of agree with both of you, actually, right? I think at the end of the day, Mike's point around talent will concentrate to the places that align with people's belief systems, I think is true. And I think it's true of customers too, right? I think customers, if they know that an organization does not support causes that they care about, then they won't, for a subsection of the market, they won't buy that stuff, right? And you see this with sustainability sustainability a lot, right? Sustainability it's become a huge issue. And so companies that have a strategy on that have done extraordinarily well by appealing to a market who really cares about that. And that is part of their buying decision. At the same time, I do think Silicon Valley has a tremendous amount of influence in the world, right? And to not acknowledge that influence and try to use that influence to move things in a direction that could, many people have different opinions on what that direction is. But to make an effort as a company and a board, and it's not just, the founder's responsibility, it's kind of the entire community's responsibility to kind of push things forward and to create a world that we think is net better in the long run. I think to kind of play on that, we are running out of time here. So I want to ask one last question on a note of optimism and making the world a better place. What are each of you most excited about for 2021? And Sarah, I will call on you first.
Lucky me. I think there's been a revival of collectivism, right? Like we've all had to change our behaviors and just be a lot more, we tend to be a very individualistic society, but I think there's been a real awakening to our collective responsibilities. So I'm quite optimistic about that as a human being. As an investor, I'm quite excited about, I think there's an opportunity for a consumer platform to emerge. And I think, a lot of the dynamics we talked about potentially limiting some of the existing platforms so that they can't acquire new startups. And that plus all of the engagement we've seen in communities created online during this pandemic. I'm quite excited about people having products that they can use to connect with people all over the world. And I want a dinner party that I can connect with people all over the world. But there's something deeply human about the need to belong and be with other people that I think has been highlighted this year. And I think we'll see that an abstract idea, but show up in a lot of great products in the years to come.
Yeah, I guess what I'm most looking forward to is that in 2019, it was a great year, and we sort of lived the way we'd become accustomed to living. And 2020 was a little bit of a tougher year. It's taught us some things that maybe we didn't know how to do very well before, and we've gotten better at. And what I'm most excited about 2021 is to live in a hybrid world where, on the one hand, we will get to go back and enjoy some of the things. We started off this conversation saying how much more I appreciate the ordinary, mundane things. I think we will have that opportunity, but at the same time, we'll have learned a whole new toolkit, a new toolkit on how to work, how to play, how to learn. And I think 2021 will be the first year where we have two toolkits: the one that we've learned from birth to 2019, and the one that we were forced to learn in 2020. And I think the balance of the two, actually, because humans, we're really good at figuring out the optimal setup in our own lives, we'll actually now have a broader set of tools to use. And so I think we'll be able to work better. I think we'll enjoy our friendships much more than we used to before. I think we'll actually be more productive. I think, generally speaking, employment's going to be a lot better than it was before, or at least in 2020. So I'm actually think it's going to be one of the more interesting and optimistic years. And it'll be fun to see how people just fundamentally figure out how to use their new toolkits. I think we're going to, see millennials invent new ways of working and playing and so forth, because they have this much broader range of tools than they did before. So very much looking forward to that.
Yeah, I would agree. I think, for me, I think the thing I'm most excited about, if with us going back to some semblance of normalcy, is obviously the return of a lot of industries that have been really struggling through this period of time. I think tech, we're in a very fortunate position where things have been more or less normal, but there's huge portions of the economy that have obviously been extraordinarily negatively impacted by COVID. So I think that getting back to normal will be fantastic. And then on a more individual and technology level, I think it's flexibility, right? I've seen a lot of friends do things that they've kind of always wanted to do. Like, I'm going to go to Portland for a month. And then guess what? They end up moving to Portland because they always wanted to live in Portland, actually. And this was the catalyst for them to do it. And we may be returning to a work environment that's conducive to letting them do that, right? So whether you want to live in the mountains, or you want to move to the beach, or you want to move back home to Maryland, or wherever you may be from, I think that's a really exciting shift in how we think about work and the balance between work and the rest of our lives, where if you don't want to live in a city, then you don't necessarily have to. I come from the country, so maybe that's a little bit of that bias coming through. But I think that's really exciting to give people the flexibility to live their lives in the way that is most conducive to, them being their happiest. So I guess with that optimistic note, we will sign off here. But thank you, everyone. Thank you, Mike and Sarah, first off, for the time. And thank you for everyone who joined us virtually. And hopefully in 2021, we'll be able to do something in person. But if not, we'll see you all soon over the internet.
We will. We must reunite in person. Thank you. Thank you, Bryan.